The moment Carl Pruitt picked up his phone, called his father, and said, "He's cracking, Dad." Best day ever. While I was still sitting 4 feet across the table from him, I knew exactly how this was going to end. Not for me, for him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter Holt. I'm 57 years old. I've spent 29 years in technical sales, the last 9 of them at Vantage Systems in Columbus, Ohio. B2B software for supply chain management. Not glamorous, but it pays well when you're good at it, and I've always been good at it. I know which clients want the data up front and which ones need 20 minutes of small talk before they'll look at a proposal. I know our product catalog better than half the engineers who built it. I also know, after nearly 3 decades in this business, when someone is trying to push me out the door before Carl Pruitt arrived, I reported to Gloria Strand. Tough, direct, fair. She held people accountable, but she also went to bat for her team when it mattered. Under her leadership, I'd built the Apex Industrial account from a cold call into one of our top 5 revenue relationships. 6 years of work, 9 meetings, 3 complete proposal revisions. When their VP of operations finally signed, Gloria pulled me aside after the team meeting and said, "That one's yours, Walter. You built that from nothing." That was 2 years before Carl showed up. Carl Pruitt was 39 when he was transferred in as our new sales manager. His father, Roger Pruitt, was regional director. I'm not going to pretend that detail wasn't relevant because everyone in the building understood exactly what it meant. Within 3 weeks of Carl's arrival, he was presenting the Apex Industrial numbers in our Monday morning meetings like he'd had a hand in closing them. He never said anything outright false. He just never corrected the implication either. I told myself it was a transition thing. New manager, getting his footing, learning the accounts. I gave him the benefit of the doubt longer than I should have. The pattern started small. Meetings scheduled at 7 a.m. with 24 hours notice. Deadlines moved up without explanation. During team huddles, Carl would single me out. "Walter, explain to everyone why the Trenton account hasn't moved in 6 weeks. He knew perfectly well that Trenton was frozen because they were mid-merger and had suspended all new vendor contracts. He had the same email chain I did, but he'd ask the question anyway, in front of the whole team, and let the silence do the work. Philip Reese, a senior account exec who'd been at Vantage almost as long as I had, pulled me aside after one of those meetings. "He's been doing his homework on you," Philip said. "Your close rate over the last 3 years was better than Carl's was when he was in sales." I looked it up. I appreciated Philip telling me. I still didn't want to believe it was that calculated. People like to assume the worst about their managers when things get uncomfortable. I'd seen it before. I told myself I was going to work the problem, not the politics. So I worked harder, earlier mornings, tighter follow-ups. I brought in 2 new mid-market accounts in a 10-week stretch. My customer satisfaction numbers on existing accounts were the highest on the team. None of it seemed to move the needle with Carl. In our one-on-ones, he'd look at the wins and find one small thing to focus on, one metric that was slightly off, one client who hadn't responded to a follow-up as quickly as Carl thought they should have. "I need people who are hungry," he told me once, not looking up from his laptop. "I need to see urgency." I was 57. I'd been closing deals before he graduated high school, but I kept my mouth shut and kept working. Then my father had his second cardiac episode. Harold Holt was 81, sharp as ever, still did the crossword every morning, still had opinions about everything, but his heart had been giving the doctors headaches for 3 years, and that Tuesday in October, it gave out enough to land him in the ICU at Riverside Methodist. I got the call at 11:40 a.m. I was at my desk. I notified Carl immediately by email, arranged for Philip to cover the one client check-in I had scheduled that afternoon, kept my phone on, and drove to the hospital. I sat with my father through the afternoon and into the evening. He was stable. By 6 p.m., tired, but talking, complained about the hospital food. Told me I looked like I needed a haircut. I drove home at 9 p.m. and found a text from Carl waiting for me. "Apex Industrial tried to reach you today. Client is unhappy. We need to talk first thing." I checked my call log. Nothing from Apex Industrial. Not a single missed call. Not a voicemail. Nothing in my email either. The next morning I went into Carl's office before the team huddle. I told him I had no record of any missed contact from Apex Industrial and asked him to forward me the details of who had called and when. He looked at me across the desk. "Are you calling me a liar, Walter?" I said I wasn't calling him anything. I just needed the details so I could follow up with the client appropriately. He never sent me anything. That afternoon, I called my main contact at Apex Industrial on the pretense of a routine check-in. Somewhere in the conversation I mentioned there had been a communication mix-up on our end the previous day, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay. He paused. "What mix-up? We didn't try to reach anyone yesterday." I got off the call and sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes. Then I went back to my desk and started keeping records. If this story is hitting close to home, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell me about the worst manager you've ever dealt with. I read every single one. Now let's get back to what happened next. I kept a running document on my personal laptop, not the company system. Email screenshots copied into the file with timestamps. Notes after every one-on-one with Carl, written up within an hour of the meeting ending. Calendar invites saved as PDFs. Voice memos recorded in my car after anything I thought might matter later. I wasn't sure what I was building. Filing a formal complaint seemed like putting a target on my back when Carl played golf with his father every other weekend and Roger Pruitt signed off on the annual review calibration. So I just kept collecting. 8 months passed. Carl's campaign was steady and unhurried. He was patient about it. I'll give him that. Small cuts, consistently applied. My official performance numbers started to reflect the reality he was constructing rather than the one I was living. He had the quarterly review data formatted before I walked into a single meeting. Down 4% against target one quarter, down 6% the next. The numbers were real, but the context had been stripped out completely. The 4% dip happened during the quarter. My father was hospitalized twice and Carl had blocked my request for a temporary flexible schedule. The 6% came after Carl reassigned 2 of my warmest leads to a newer rep without telling me until after the deals closed. By March, I knew exactly what the annual performance review was going to look like. I also knew I was going to be ready for it. The night before the review, I sat at my kitchen table and went through everything in my documentation folder, 8 months of notes. I organized it by date and by incident type. I wrote a 2-page summary, bullet points, numbered exhibits, cross-referenced with the audio and document files. I printed 2 copies and put them in my laptop bag. Then I set my phone to record audio and put it in my jacket pocket. I got to the office at 7:45, made coffee. Checked in on my father by phone. He was having a decent morning, he said. Told me to stop worrying. At 9 a.m., I walked into the conference room on the 2nd floor. Carl was already there, door closed behind me. It started the way I expected it to start. Carl had a printed slide deck, 4 pages, stapled. He slid a copy across the table to me without saying anything. Let me look at it for a moment, then started talking. I want to walk through your numbers for the year, he said. I think we both know this hasn't been your best stretch. The slide deck showed my quarterly performance against target. The 4% gap, the 6% gap, a bar chart that made both numbers look like cliffs. No context, no comparison to team average. No mention of the accounts I'd brought in or the retention numbers on my existing book. I kept my expression neutral and let him talk. He went through the Trenton account, called it stalled. I mentioned the merger freeze and the client's written request to pause outreach. Carl nodded slowly like I'd said something mildly interesting and moved on without acknowledging it. He brought up a mid-market prospect I'd been developing since October. Said I'd let it go cold. I pointed out that the contact had gone on medical leave in November and the company had asked all vendors to hold off until Q2. Carl had been copied on that email. I need people who find a way around obstacles, he said, not people who accept them. He stood up. Carl always stood up when he was getting to the part he'd been building toward. He started pacing the length of the conference room, hands in his pockets, like he was thinking something through in real time. He wasn't. He'd rehearsed this. Honestly, Walter, I've been trying to figure out the right way to have this conversation for a while now. He paused at the window. You've been here 9 years. I respect that, but respect doesn't close deals. And what I'm seeing in these numbers tells me we might have a fit problem. A fit problem. That's what he called it. The thing is, he continued, turning back toward me, a documented performance gap combined with an inability to adapt to new leadership expectations. That's a very specific kind of documentation. It tells a story. He sat on the edge of the table, closer than he needed to be. It was a dominance move, the kind you learn in a weekend sales seminar when you're 26 and think you've figured something out. I want to be honest with you, he said. I think you know where this is heading. I'd been holding it together for 8 months. The early meetings, the public call-outs, the manufactured story about Apex Industrial, the leads that got quietly reassigned, the quarterly numbers stripped of all context and presented like a verdict. 8 months of showing up, keeping records, doing the work, watching Carl build his case one small brick at a time. I started to respond. I had a calm, specific answer ready, but when I opened my mouth, something in my voice came out different than I intended, quieter, a little rough, not breaking, not emotional, just worn. The way a piece of machinery sounds when it's been running too long without maintenance. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Carl heard it, he stopped talking. His expression shifted in a way I recognized immediately. Not concern, not discomfort, satisfaction. He picked up his phone off the table, he dialed. Dad, he said, turning maybe 20 degrees away from me like I wasn't sitting right there. It's happening? He's cracking. A short laugh. Yeah, best day ever. It's finally done. He hung up, set the phone back on the table, spread his hands wide and looked at me like he'd just closed the biggest deal of his career. I'm sorry, Walter. I really am. But this is exactly the kind of documentation I needed. The conference room was quiet for a moment. I looked at Carl, then I looked down at my jacket pocket. The recording app had been running since I walked through the door. I picked up my copy of his slide deck, straightened it once against the table, set it back down. Then I looked at him. Mine too, I said. He blinked. What? Best day ever. I stood up, buttoned my jacket. Mine too, Carl. He said something as I walked to the door, something about insubordination, about how walking out would be noted. I heard it. I didn't stop. I walked through the sales floor at a normal pace. Philip looked up from his desk and caught my eye. I gave him a small nod and kept moving to the elevator. In the lobby, I found a chair near the windows, away from the front desk. I opened my laptop bag and took out the 2-page summary I'd put together the night before. Bullet points. Numbered exhibits, a clean table of contents at the top. 8 months of documentation compressed into something a person could read in 4 minutes and understand completely. I reviewed it once. Added one line about the phone call to Roger Pruitt with the approximate time. Then I closed the laptop, put the summary back in the bag, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. I had never been to the HR department before. Soft blue walls, quieter than the rest of the building. A receptionist looked up when I came in. She took one look at my face and asked if I needed to sit down. I told her I needed to speak with Lorraine Voss. 5 minutes later, I was sitting across a small conference table from the HR director. Lorraine Voss was in her late 40s, calm in the way that suggested she had heard a lot of difficult things in this room and had learned not to react to any of them too quickly. I slid the 2-page summary across the table before I said a word. I have audio that goes with this, I told her. I want to be upfront about that before we go any further. She read the summary without interrupting. When she finished, she set it down and folded her hands on top of it. Play the recording, she said. Carl's voice filled the small room, the performance review, the pacing, the slide deck framing, the phone call to his father. He's cracking, Dad. Best day ever. The silence after I said mine too. When it finished, Lorraine didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I need to escalate this today. Can you email me that audio file right now from this room? I could. By 4 p.m., Carl Pruitt had been placed on administrative leave. Philip texted me that evening. Security walked him out an hour ago. He did not look happy. What did you do? I was already on the highway heading to Riverside Methodist to sit with my father. Harold was having a good night sitting up in the bed, TV on low, a crossword puzzle book open on his lap with about half the squares filled in. He looked up when I walked in and immediately said I needed a haircut. I pulled the chair up next to the bed and sat down. He muted the TV. You look like something's on your mind, he said. Work stuff. I told him. I'll fill you in when there's more to tell. He studied me for a moment the way fathers do, the long look that doesn't need words. Then he nodded once and unmuted the TV. We watched the tail end of a news program together without talking much. Before I left, he squeezed my arm and told me to get some sleep. I drove home thinking about what Lorraine had said before I left her office. Standard procedure. Investigation begins immediately. Carl is not permitted to contact employees or enter the building during the process. Expect 5 to 10 business days. 5 to 10 business days felt like a long time to sit still. I didn't sit still. The following morning I was back at my desk by 7:30. Sandra Kell had been named interim manager. She was organized, low drama, and smart enough to know that the best thing she could do that first week was stay out of people's way and let the team work. She checked in with me briefly that first morning, asked how I was doing, and then left me alone, which was exactly what I needed. Around 10 a.m., I pulled up the contract management system to review my account histories. I had a legitimate reason to be in there. I was preparing updated account summaries as part of the documentation Lorraine had asked me to compile, records showing my actual client relationship history versus what Carl's performance reviews had claimed. I started with Apex Industrial because it was my largest account and the one Carl had most aggressively misrepresented. I found the original contract I had submitted. Then I found the version that had been processed by finance. They were not the same document. The pricing structure on the finance version was different. I sat there and looked at both files on my screen for probably a full minute before I was sure I was reading it correctly. The service tier fees had been adjusted. The difference across the contract term came out to 12% of the total contract value. The client signatures on both documents were identical, not similar. Identical down to the pixel. One had been copied from the other. The client had never seen or approved the changed version. I did not move fast after that. I sat with it. I thought about what I was looking at and what it meant, and whether there was any other explanation I was missing. I could not find one. I went back through my other active accounts one by one. By the end of the day, I had found 4 more contracts with the same pattern: adjusted pricing structures, copied signatures, finance versions that did not match what the client had signed. 5 contracts total, all of them modified sometime in the 8 months since Carl had taken over. The commission differences on each one were not large amounts individually, but they were consistent, and they had all been calculated to land just below the dollar threshold that would trigger an automatic review by the finance audit team. That was not a coincidence. That was someone who understood how the internal controls worked and had designed the scheme around them. I needed to know where the money was going. The contracts themselves didn't tell me that. The payment records were in a separate system I didn't have access to, but the email trail might. Carl had been careful. The contract files in the current system showed his edit history had been cleared, but VantEdge had been in the middle of a server migration for the past year. The IT department had been archiving old data from our legacy mail server and moving it to the new cloud platform. The migration wasn't finished. The old server was still live and still holding sent folder data from any account that hadn't been fully transferred yet. Carl's account was on the migration list. It had not been completed. I called IT support and asked whether I could request a sent folder archive pull for a contract dispute I was documenting. The tech told me that for account managers reviewing their own client correspondence, legacy archive requests were permitted through a standard form. I submitted the form using Apex Industrial as the reference account. The archive came back the next morning. There were 11 emails in the relevant date range. Most of them were routine, but 3 of them were sent to an address I didn't recognize at a domain I had never seen before. The domain belonged to a company called Apex Procurement LLC. I looked up Apex Procurement LLC on the Ohio Secretary of State Business Registry. Public search available to anyone with a browser. The LLC had been registered 2 years ago. The registered agent was a woman whose last name was Pruitt. I cross-referenced the name against a financing disclosure Carl's division had filed with the parent company 18 months earlier, which was part of a document package available through our internal compliance portal. Carl was listed as a silent partner. I sat with that for a while too. Then I called Philip. "I need you to do me a favor," I told him. "You mentioned Carl came from the Cincinnati division before he transferred here. Do you know anyone over there?" Philip knew someone in their operations team. He made a call that afternoon. The person Philip reached said that there had been some irregularities in contract processing during Carl's time there. Nothing had been formally investigated. Carl had transferred out before anyone had put the pieces together clearly enough to escalate. I had enough. That evening, I went back to my kitchen table and built a second summary document. This one was longer than 2 pages. I organized it by account with dates, contract version comparisons, and the email thread references. I included the Ohio Secretary of State registration details and the compliance portal filing as exhibits. Everything was sourced from systems I was authorized to access or from public records. I printed 3 copies. The next morning, I called Lorraine and asked if she could schedule a follow-on meeting that included someone from legal. She was quiet for a second. "Is this related to the harassment complaint?" "It started that way," I said. "But it's bigger than that now." She scheduled the meeting for 2 p.m. Norman Drummond, VP of Employee Relations, would be there. So would Marlene Cook from the legal team. I spent the rest of the morning at my desk, working my accounts, returning client emails, following up on a new prospect Philip had flagged for me. Eugene Baird from customer service stopped by to say he was glad I was back. Cecilia Fordy, one of the other sales reps, gave me a quick nod when we passed in the hallway that said more than a full conversation would have. At 1:55, I picked up my laptop bag and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Norman Drummond was already in the conference room when I arrived. He was in his mid-50s, the kind of guy who had been in corporate HR long enough to have seen most things and who carried that experience in a way that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm either. Marlene Cook from legal was next to him, silver-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses on the table in front of her. Lorraine sat across from them. I set my laptop bag on the table and took out 3 copies of the summary document, one for each of them. "Before we get into it," Marlene said, "I want to be clear that I represent VantEdge Systems, not individual employees." "I understand," I said. "What I'm about to show you protects the company's interests." I gave them a few minutes to read through the summary. Nobody talked. Norman got about halfway through his copy and started over from the beginning. Marlene put her glasses on before she'd finished the first page. When they looked up, I walked them through it. I started with the contract discrepancies. Pulled up both versions of the Apex Industrial contract side by side on my laptop and turned the screen so all 3 of them could see. The original I had submitted. The version processed by finance, the pricing difference, the copied signatures. Marlene leaned forward and studied the screen for a long moment. "The client never approved this version. No, I said. I confirmed that directly with their VP of operations when I noticed the discrepancy. He had no knowledge of any pricing adjustment. I walked them through the other 4 accounts with the same pattern. Then I explained how the commission differences had been sized, each one landing just under the finance audit threshold. Norman said, "That level of precision suggests someone who understood our internal controls." "Yes," I said. "It does." Then I showed them the email thread from the legacy server archive and explained how I had accessed it through the standard IT request process for account managers reviewing client correspondence. I explained the server migration, why the data was still there, and why the request was within my authorized access. Norman glanced at Marlene. She gave a small nod without looking up from the document. I showed them the Apex Procurement LLC registration from the Ohio Secretary of State Public Search, the registered agent with the last name Pruitt, then the silent partner listing from the compliance portal filing. The room was quiet for a moment after that. Marlene took her glasses off. "How long did it take you to put this together?" "Most of it came together over 2 days," I said. "But I'd been keeping records of other things for 8 months. Once I saw the contract discrepancy, I knew what I was looking at." Norman set his copy of the summary down flat on the table. "Why didn't you bring this to us during the initial complaint?" "Because I needed to be certain," I said. "A harassment complaint is one thing. This is fraud. Clients signed contracts that were changed without their knowledge. I wasn't going to bring that to you until I could show you exactly what happened and exactly where the money went." Marlene was already writing. She asked me several specific questions about the IT archive request process, the compliance portal access, and whether I had shared any of this information with anyone outside the company. I answered all of it. Then I mentioned the Cincinnati division. I told them that a contact at Carl's previous posting had indicated there had been similar contract irregularities during Carl's time there. Nothing formally investigated. Carl had transferred before it escalated. Norman looked at Lorraine. Something passed between them that I wasn't meant to fully read but couldn't miss. "We'll need to conduct a forensic audit," Marlene said, "and we'll need your full cooperation throughout that process." I told her she had it. I handed over a USB drive with copies of all my documentation files, organized by account and date. As the meeting wrapped up, I asked one direct question. Roger Pruitt signed the approval on 3 of those contracts as part of his standard batch review process. I want to understand whether that creates a problem for the investigation. Norman was quiet for a beat. "That's something we'll need to look into as part of the audit." Marlene added, "The batch approval workflow does create a scenario where a senior reviewer might sign off without examining individual line items. Whether that's what happened here is something forensic accounting will determine." I thanked them and left. I didn't feel the way I thought I'd feel walking out of that room. There was no rush of satisfaction. Mostly, I just felt tired in the way you feel after you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. The weight is gone, but your arms still remember it. Back at my desk, I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. "How are you feeling today?" I asked. "Like a man who's been in a hospital for 2 weeks," he said. "Tell me something interesting." I told him I'd had a productive meeting, that things at work were moving in the right direction. He asked a few questions, sharp and specific the way he always was, and I answered them without giving him the full picture yet. I didn't want to get into the details until there was a real outcome to report. "You sound better than you did the other night," he said. "I am," I told him. "I'll come by after work." The next 3 weeks were the kind of busy that doesn't leave much room for anything else. I split my time between my regular accounts and the forensic audit process, which moved faster than I expected once the outside accounting firm came in. They found everything I had found and then kept going. The pattern extended further back than 8 months. There were contract irregularities tied to accounts Carl had managed during his first 2 months at Vantage before he'd fully settled into his approach. The forensic team also confirmed what the Cincinnati contact had suggested. Carl had run a version of the same scheme at his previous position. The amounts were smaller and the method was less refined, but the structure was the same. He had gotten better at it over time. Roger Pruitt had signed 3 of the modified contracts through the batch approval workflow. Whether he had understood what he was signing became a question the investigators took seriously. The audit found no evidence he had personally benefited from the diverted commissions. It also found that his oversight practices had been lax enough to make the scheme significantly easier to execute. He resigned before the investigation formally concluded. Affected clients were notified. All 5 contracts were corrected to their original terms. Commission differences were calculated and restitution was prepared. Lorraine's team worked with compliance to build new verification checkpoints into the contract approval process, controls that should have existed years earlier. Carl was terminated effective immediately once the forensic audit confirmed the findings. The matter was referred to law enforcement. I heard about all of this in pieces through Lorraine and through Norman over the course of 3 weeks. I kept showing up to work every day, working my accounts, rebuilding a couple of client relationships that had gotten rocky during Carl's tenure. The week the audit formally concluded, Apex Industrial reached out directly. Their VP of Operations asked to speak with me. He told me they had been made aware of the contract situation, that Vantage had handled it with full transparency, and that as far as they were concerned, the relationship was intact. He said they had been meaning to discuss expanding their contract for the coming year and would like to schedule time. I told him I'd get something on the calendar that week, and that's how it goes when you keep doing the work. If you're still with me, I appreciate it. Hit like and subscribe if this story is connecting with you, and leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. Now let me tell you how it ended. Norman Drummond called me into his office on a Thursday morning, about a week after the forensic audit wrapped up. I went in expecting more questions about the investigation. He had a folder on his desk and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He pushed the folder to the side and looked at me directly. "We'd like to offer you the sales manager position," he said. "Permanent. Your team, your structure." I had thought about this possibility. Not obsessively, but it had crossed my mind during the past few weeks in the way that practical things do when you're in the middle of something that's clearly heading toward a conclusion. I told Norman I was interested, but that I had some conditions. He leaned back in his chair. "Let's hear them." I told him I wanted to hand-select my own team going forward, including any new hires, without routing approvals through anyone connected to the prior chain of command. I wanted direct hiring authority. He nodded slowly. "That's manageable." I told him I wanted full restitution of 8 months of commission discrepancies, calculated against the original contract terms on all 5 affected accounts, paid out before I signed any new employment agreement. He glanced toward the window for a moment, then he looked back at me. "Marlene already has those numbers. That's been in process." I told him the third condition was that I wanted the new role structured with a direct reporting line to Norman himself, not filtered through the regional director layer, while Vantage completed whatever organizational review was coming after Roger Pruitt's resignation. Norman was quiet for a few seconds. He picked up his coffee cup, remembered it was cold, and set it back down. Then he looked at Marlene's empty chair next to me, the one she had sat in during our previous meeting, as if checking something with a person who wasn't there. He turned back to me. "Done," he said. "All 3. We shook hands. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and looked at my screen for a minute without doing anything. Philip rolled his chair over from the next row. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" "The look you had 9 months ago when Apex Industrial signed. Like you knew something was going to work out, and you're just now allowing yourself to believe it." I told him I'd taken the manager position. He put out his hand, and I shook it. "About time," he said. "We've been waiting for someone who actually knows what they're doing." That evening I drove to Riverside Methodist. Harold was having one of his better days. He was out of bed, sitting in the chair by the window with the crossword book, most of it filled in. He looked up when I walked in, and this time he didn't say anything about the haircut. I pulled up a chair next to him and told him everything, start to finish. The performance review, the recording, the contract discrepancies, the sent folder, the Ohio Business Registry, the forensic audit, Roger Pruitt's resignation, Carl's termination, the referral to law enforcement. The 3 conditions Norman saying done. Harold listened the way he always listened. No interruptions, no expressions of shock or outrage or excitement. Just steady attention, the kind that tells you the other person is actually hearing what you're saying. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He set the crossword book on the windowsill and looked out at the parking lot below. Then he turned to me and squeezed my arm once. Firm. "That's how we used to handle it, son." That was enough. 4 months later, Carl Pruitt accepted a plea agreement, fraud and embezzlement charges. Restitution, a short sentence. And from what I heard through people who heard through other people, he moved out of Ohio not long after. I've been in the sales manager role for 6 months now. The team is solid. Philip is still next to me, same as always. Eugene and Cecilia are both hitting their numbers. Sandra Kell moved into a project management role she's been wanting for 2 years and seems genuinely happier for it. My father had a stable cardiology review last month. The doctor used the words holding steady, which in the context of an 81-year-old man's heart is about as good as it gets. He still does the crossword every morning. Still has opinions about everything. I still drive the same route to work I've driven for 9 years. I still know the Apex Industrial account better than anyone. I still get to the office earlier than most people. Some things don't change. That's not a bad thing. Here's what I want to say to you directly. If you've spent years building something at a job, years of real work and real relationships and real results, and someone showed up and started dismantling it one small cut at a time, you already know how long that kind of thing can go on before you do something about it. You keep giving the benefit of the doubt. You keep adjusting. You keep telling yourself it'll even out. It doesn't even out on its own. I'm not telling you to go to war with your employer. I'm telling you what worked for me. Pay attention. Keep records, stay methodical, and when the moment comes, walk in with documentation instead of emotion. The most powerful thing a man with 30 years of experience can do is make sure the truth is organized and ready when the room finally goes quiet. That's not revenge. That's just knowing your own value well enough to defend it. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me about a time you finally stood your ground after holding back longer than you should have. I read every one. Until next time.